the square and walked as far as the marketplace more than once. From there her house was down the street on the left, but every time she came to it she changed her mind about going in and turned back into the maze of alleys adjoining the monastery. The marketplace of Krestovostvichensk was as big as a field. In times gone by, it had been crowded on market days with peasants' carts. At one end of it was Leninskaya Street. The other formed a sharp arc lined with 1- or 2-story buildings used for warehouses, offices, and workshops. There, she remembered, in more peaceful times, Brukyanov, a boorish misogynist in spectacles and a long frock coat, who dealt in leather, oats, and hay, cartwheels and harness, would read the penny paper as he sat importantly on a chair outside his great, 4-paneled iron door. And there, in a small dim window, a few pairs of beribboned wedding candles and posies in cardboard boxes gathered dust for years. While in the small room at the back, empty of either furniture or goods except for a pile of large round cakes of wax, 1,000-ruble deals were made by the unknown agents of a millionaire candle manufacturer who lived nobody knew where. There, in the middle of the row of shops, was the galuzins'large grocery store with its 3 windows. Its bare, splintery floor was swept morning, noon, and night with used tea leaves. Galuzin and his assistants drank tea all day long. And here Galuzina as a young married woman had often and willingly sat at the cash box. Her favorite color was a violet mauve, the color of church vestments on certain solemn days, the color of lilac in bud, the color of her best velvet dress and of her set of crystal wine glasses. It was the color of happiness and of her memories. And Russia too, in her pre-evolutionary virginity, seemed to her to have been the color of lilac. She had enjoyed sitting at the cash box because the violet dusk in the shop, fragrant with starch, sugar, and purple black-currant caramels in glass jars, had matched her favorite color. Here at the corner, beside the timber yard, stood an old, grey frame house which had settled on all 4 sides like a dilapidated coach. It had 2 stories and 2 entrances, one at either end. Each floor was divided in 2. Downstairs were Zalkine's pharmacy on the right and a notary's office on the left. Above the pharmacist lived old Shmulevich, a lady's tailor, with his big family. The flat across the landing from Shmulevich, and above the notary, was crammed with lodgers whose trades and professions were stated on cards and signs covering the whole of the door. Here watches were mended and shoes cobbled. Here Kaminsky, the engraver, had his workroom and 2 photographers, Zuk and Shrodak, worked in partnership. As the first-floor premises were overcrowded, the photographer's young assistants, Blazhein, a student, and Magitsen, who retouched the photographs, had fixed up a darkroom at one end of the large woodshed in the yard. To judge by the angry red eye of the lamp winking blearily in the darkroom window, they were working there now. It was underneath this window that the puppy, Timok, sat on his chain and yelped, so that you could hear him all along Leninskaya Street. There they all are in a pack, the whole Kahila, thought Galuzina as she passed the grey house. It's a den of filthy beggars. And yet, she reflected at once, her husband carried his Jew-hating too far. After all, these people were not important enough to affect Russia's destinies. Though, if you asked old Shmulevich why he thought the country was in such turmoil and disorder, he would twist and turn and contort his ugly face into a grin and say, "That's Libishka up to his tricks." Oh, but what nonsense was she wasting her time thinking about? Did they matter? Were they Russia's misfortune? Her misfortune was the towns. Not that the country stood or fell by the towns. But the towns were educated. And the country people had had their heads turned. They envied the education of the towns and tried to copy their ways and could not catch up with them, so now they were neither one thing nor the other. Or perhaps it was the other way around, perhaps ignorance was the trouble. An educated man can see through walls, he knows everything in advance, while the rest of us are like people in a dark wood. We only miss our hats when our heads have been chopped off. Not that the educated people were having an easy time now. Look at the way the famine was driving them out of the towns. How confusing all this was. Even the devil couldn't make head or tail of it. And yet, it was the country people who knew how to live. Look at her relatives, the Silitvins, Shilaburins, Pamphilpalik, the brothers Nestor and Pankratmatik. They relied on their own hands and their own heads, they were their own masters. The new farmsteads along the highway were a lovely sight. 40 acres of arable land, with sheep, horses, pigs, cows, and enough corn in the barns for 3 years ahead. And their farming machines. They even had harvesters. Kalkak was buttering them up, trying to get them on his side, and so were the commissars, to get them into the forest army. They had come back from the war with St. George crosses and everyone was after them, wanting to employ them as instructors. Epaulets or no epaulets, if you knew your job you were always in demand. You would always land on your feet. But it was time she went home. It wasn't decent for a woman to be wandering about the streets so late. It wouldn't have mattered so much if she had been in her own garden. But it was so muddy, it was like a bog. Anyway, she thought, she felt a little better now. Thus entangled in her reflections and having quite lost the thread of them, Galuzina went home. But before she went inside, she stood for a moment in front of the porch, going over a few more things in her mind. She thought of the people who were lording it in Kadatskoy now. She knew more or less what they were like. They were former political exiles from the capitals, Tverdin, Antipov, the anarchist Black Banner Vdovikenko, the local locksmith Mad Dog Gorzheny. They were cunning and they knew their own minds, they had stirred up plenty of trouble in their day, they were sure to be plotting something again now. They couldn't live unless they were up to something. They spent their lives dealing with machines, and they were cold and merciless as machines. They went about in sweaters under their jackets, they smoked through bone cigarette holders, and they drank boiled water for fear of catching something. Poor Vilas was wasting his time, these men would turn everything upside down, they would always get their way. Then she thought about herself. She knew she was a fine woman, with a mind of her own, intelligent and well preserved. All in all, she was not a bad person. But none of her qualities was appreciated in this God-forsaken hole nor anywhere else, for all she knew. The indecent song about the silly old woman Senteti Urika, which was well known throughout the Urals, came into her mind, but only the first 2 lines could be quoted. Senteti Urika sold her cart and bought a balalaika. After this came nothing but obscenities. They sang it in Krestovostvichansk, aiming it, she suspected, at herself. She sighed bitterly and went into the house. 5. She went straight to her bedroom, without stopping in the hall to take off her coat. The room looked out into the garden. Now, at night, the massed shadows on this side of the window and outside it almost repeated each other. The limp, drooping shapes of the curtains were like the limp, drooping shapes of the bare, dark trees in the garden with their uncertain outlines. The velvety darkness in the garden, where the winter was almost over, was being warmed by the dark purple heat of the coming spring bursting out of the ground. And there was a similar interaction of 2 elements inside the room with its dusty curtains, where the airless darkness was softened by the warm dark violet tones of the coming feast. The Virgin in the icon, freeing her dark, narrow hands from the silver covering, held them up, seeming to hold in each the first and last letters of her Greek name, Mtauadero Theta Epsilon Omicron, Mother of God. The garnet-colored icon lamp, dark as an inkwell in its gold bracket, scattered its star-shaped light, splintered by the cut glass, on the bedroom carpet. Taking off her coat and kerchief, Galuzina made an awkward movement and felt her old pain, a stitch in the side under her shoulder blade. She gave a frightened cry and murmured, "Mighty protectress of the sorrowful, chaste Mother of God, help of the afflicted, shelter of the universe." Halfway through the prayer she burst into tears. When the pain died down, she began to undo her dress, but the hooks at the back slipped through her fingers and got lost in the soft crinkled stuff. She had difficulty in finding them. Her ward Kasyasha woke up and came into the room. "Why are you in the dark, mother? Shall I bring a lamp?" "No, don't. There's enough light. Let me undo your dress, mother. Don't tire yourself. My fingers are all thumbs, I could cry. And that tailor didn't have the sense to sew the hooks on so that you can get at them. I've got a notion to rip them all off and throw them at his ugly face." How well they sang at the monastery. It's so still, you could hear it from the house. The singing was all right, but I'm not feeling so well, my girl. I've got that stitch again here and here. Everywhere. It's such a nuisance, I don't know what to do. The homeopath, Stydovsky, helped you the last time. He's always telling you to do something impossible. He's a quack, your homeopath. That's one thing. And the other thing is that he's gone away. He's gone, I tell you, he's left town. And he isn't the only one, they've all rushed off just before the holiday. As if they expected an earthquake or something. Well, then, what about that Hungarian doctor, the one who is a prisoner of war? His treatment did you good. That's no use either. I tell you, there isn't a soul left. Kiranai Ilehos is with the other.